Well, good afternoon again. I realize it's like we've had you on a forced march drill all day. This has been a very, very comprehensive agenda, and I think that the last panel will not disappoint in terms of injecting any number of other issues, some of which have been touched upon, but now much more comprehensively. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Pollack, Senior Fellow in the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies here at Brookings. We are fortunate to have today an exemplary panel in terms of people with very, very diverse experience, both in the government world, but also all people who have thought and written seriously about many of the issues that we'll touch upon today. Our topic this afternoon is the evolving security environment as seen from different perspectives, different capitals, if you will. It's also a fair question, I think, to ask whether the events from yesterday, which of course were American domestic politics, whether it would change at all, and in what ways, the agenda that might come up next week in Beijing and beyond. So the sequence we will go in is from my left, my good colleague, Richard Bush, followed by our friend and non-resident senior fellow whom we're delighted to have here today, Tom Christensen from Princeton. And then finally, I would say batting cleanup, but here Richard has already told me that you need 4 people to bat cleanup, but that Jeff Bader will follow. The very rough division of labor I've created for today is simply to ask Richard to speak to questions related to how he sees the United States perceiving what we are broadly calling security in the Asia-Pacific region. I realize that's a very, very elastic concept, depending on how you define security and what kinds of issues you examine and how you debate these issues, both internally and externally, but I'm sure Richard will do an exemplary job. I've asked Tom to do the same, not so much from the point of view of telling us the inner thinking of the Chinese leadership, but Tom has recently returned from an extended visit to Asia, including time in China, and I think might have some interesting perspectives on how Chinese that he spoke to conceptualized issues of security and the like. And finally, Jeff will conclude both with an eye towards what we should anticipate next week and whether indeed there is a ground on which the United States and China and others can meet to address what, without getting overly discouraged, looks like a pretty daunting international security agenda. So without further delay, Richard, welcome back after many, many weeks on the road, and we'll all look forward to your remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I just want to identify a couple of major risks and uncertainties that I think are animating the Obama administration as we go into this summit. And I'm going to start with the risks and uncertainties that are clear and present. The first of these is in the East and South China Seas, where, to my mind, there's a danger of some kind of accidental physical clash between China's maritime vessels and aircraft with those of other countries in the region, including of those of the United States. Now, such a clash could come about as countries that claim islands and rocks assert their claims in a relatively assertive and unrestrained way. Obviously, a clash in the air is more dangerous than one at sea for obvious reasons. Now, the Obama administration for a long time has stressed that the way to reduce the possibility of such clashes and everything that would come with them is for the parties concerned to work out understandings to regulate how maritime vessels and aircraft operate. This is not a new problem. There are ways to do this. Also vexing for the United States is the tendency of Chinese entities to expand China's presence in the South China Sea very incrementally, and that complicates any effort to deter or resist those moves. But the end result is the same. China's presence is expanded, and our friends and allies are disturbed by both the changes in the status quo and what they perceive as a U.S. reluctance to respond. So second, there is always the danger of increased tensions on the Korean Peninsula. This could come as a result of a new North Korean nuclear and missile tests, which might lead America's allies to question our deterrent resolve. Although I'm prepared to believe that China, through some mix of incentives and disincentives, has dissuaded Pyongyang from doing these tests, I'm somewhat fatalistic. I think at the point that North Korea decides, for technical and political reasons, that it's time to test, it will do so, and it will have already created some pretext for going ahead. Now, tensions and outright conflict could also occur because North Korea undertakes limited conventional attacks on South Korea, as it did in 2010. Unlike 2010, I believe that the South will likely respond more robustly and violently, which raises the possibility of escalation and the challenge of escalation control. One place where I do not yet see a security risk is over Taiwan. It is true that Taiwan will hold a presidential election in 2016, and that opens up the prospect for a change in cross-strait relations, which have been pretty stable for the last 6.5 years. But we don't know who will be running in the election. We don't know who will win. We don't know what their policies will be and how Beijing will assess those policies for its own interests. So it's really too early to say. Stay tuned. My third risk and uncertainty is longer term, and it is the possibility of strategic rivalry between China and the United States. And rivalry could occur for a combination of reasons. If Beijing and Washington end up at continuing loggerheads on specific points of friction, like the East China Sea, South China Sea, North Korea, Taiwan, and other things, that could lead each to draw dire and broader conclusions about the other's long-term intentions, and so lock in a certain policy mindset. Second, I think China is becoming less and less willing to accommodate to the United States, as it often did over the last 3+ decades. Some say it has begun to capitalize on its growing power and influence to gradually build its own China-centric regional order. Third reason for my concern is that China's regional military strategy is focused on reducing the freedom of action of the U.S. Navy and Air Force in its, quote, near seas, unquote. And that complicates any effort by the United States to help our friends and allies defend themselves if we should ever have to do so. And finally, there is growing disagreement, I think, over bilateral rules of the economic game, on how open each economy should be to the business activities of the other, and on China's theft of U.S. corporate secrets, as we've heard a couple of times today. So the list of regional security concerns, both current and long-term, is not short. It tends to get longer every day, and that is all the more reason why the leaders of the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly the leaders of China and the United States, need to gather periodically in the hopes of mitigating and managing these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for being admirably brief and appropriately throwing out things to make us feel a little depressed.
He ceded his time to me.
Yes, right.
That's right.
Yes. Well, now, Tom, we'll turn to you and ask whether you would see a view or views from Beijing. How would you see it similar or different from what Richard has outlined? But
well, thanks a lot, Jonathan, and thanks to Chung. This is a great event, and I'm really pleased to be here, and on this panel especially. It's a great honor to be here with this group. And I'm going to say what I think I heard in Beijing, Chinese views. So I'm supposed to say at the outset that since I advise the State Department, that My views are not the same as the State Department, but they're Chinese views, so they're not the same as the State Department. So it's pretty obvious, right? And I also would just ask you, please just hear me out and don't shoot the messenger, right? I'm reporting to you what I heard. Don't say Tom Christensen said X, Y, or Z. I'm reporting to you what I heard about their views about the United States foreign policy towards China, United States foreign policy towards the Asia-Pacific region, and United States foreign policy around the world, to touch on some of the issues that came up in the previous panel. So I'll go in that order. And I was somewhat surprised about what I heard about the bilateral relationship, because I've spent a lot of time in Washington on my sabbatical year this year. And I've heard a lot of American observers outside the U.S. government talk about how unstable the U.S.-China bilateral relationship is. And I heard a lot of confidence about the actual bilateral relationship in China, that it can't get too bad and it can't get too good. We have a very strong economic relationship. We have lots of dialogue on the diplomatic side. We have an improved mill-mill dialogue. It's not going to get too bad. It's not going to get too good for all the reasons that others laid out earlier. We have different political systems. We have differences of opinion over various serious issues. So it's pretty stable. And the only thing I really heard on the negative side was disappointment. And that disappointment took the form of the Obama administration didn't latch on to the new type great power relationship slogan that we like so much, that Xi Jinping likes so much. And it became pretty clear, and it was always pretty clear to me, that what the Chinese mean by new type great power relations is actually old type great power relations. It's sphere of influence. We have our sphere of influence. You don't mess with it, and we avoid World War I because you don't mess with our sphere of influence, and we don't have escalating tensions. So there's been some frustration, particularly as it gets to the regional affairs in the region, that the United States, while the bilateral relationship is solid, the United States seems to be, from a Chinese perspective, to be mucking around in the region, causing regional instability between China and its neighbors, not directly between China and the United States. And while the sphere of influence idea is there for the great power, new type great power relations, there are people in China who are unsatisfied with China's recent foreign policy, going back to the late Hu Jintao years to the Xi Jinping years. They believe that China has been too assertive in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and they've unnecessarily caused tensions with neighbors, and they need to return to a more moderate approach. There are people like that, and I talked to several of them, and their view is that it's very hard for them, because of U.S. foreign policy, to gain traction in domestic debates. And they complain about basically two realities from their perspective. And one is that the United States has chosen a relatively assertive or provocative slogan for its own foreign policy, whether it be pivot or rebalancing. The United States has pictured itself as very muscular, returning to Asia after the wars of the last decade and taking on China. And that is used by hawks in China against them in internal debates when they raise arguments about, well, maybe we need to moderate our policies. And then that colors the perception of the American actions. And I would say that even the moderates think that the U.S. actions have been too assertive and too supportive of disputants in the disputes that China has with its neighbors. And that's the Philippines and the Second Thomas Shoal, the partial lifting of an arms embargo on Vietnam, P8 access to Malaysia, various statements about international law and freedom of navigation, and even in economic affairs, the idea that maybe the United States is trying to block China from making progress on some of its new initiatives that Chung raised earlier when he was playing the moderator role. The second issue that they raise, and again, don't shoot the messenger, is that the United States is seen as distracted and weak. And I'll go in reverse order. Weak. The Obama administration is seen as weak at home and weak abroad in China. And this was told to me by people who don't agree with the analysis. They say, we actually don't see it that way. We understand American politics. But we lose in the domestic debate because the Obama administration is widely seen as weak, particularly in the second term. It's a question that was raised. Why is the foreign policy of the United States weaker in the second term than in the first? That usually is the reverse. The second thing is more about the pivot or the rebalance, which is it seems like some people in China bought into the argument that is implied by the pivot and the rebalance, which is the United States can really only do one thing at once. So if the United States can only do one thing at once, then since you have ISIS and you have the Middle East, and Secretary Kerry is very engaged in the Middle East, therefore you're distracted in East Asia, which means the hawks can say, not only are the Americans wanting to come after us, but they're unable to defend these allies and friends that they have incited into taking provocative action, and we don't need to curb our own behavior because the United States can't actually back up what they're doing in the region. So we should push forward, and don't tell me to moderate my behavior. That's unwarranted and unnecessary. So then we get to the U.S. around the world, and this is the last piece, the global governance piece. And here I really noticed in my stay in China, which was relatively brief, it was about 9 days, and I talked to various people, but I also watched the television and television news, and I was surprised at how objective the Chinese television news was about Kobani in Syria. It seems like the Chinese government, from my reading of watching the news, they're really concerned about ISIS for reasons David raised before. They're really concerned that the Middle East is unstable, and this will have implications for Xinjiang and for the Middle East itself, which China cares a lot about. But I think that while there's this shared sense of concern about global stability and Islamic extremism, no love for ISIS, and no glee that the United States seems to be doing poorly in Iraq and Syria, I think that there's a problem in the analysis that they just don't believe the United States is a good partner, even if they were willing to partner with the United States. That the United States doesn't have a wise strategy towards these problems. And they cite Libya and Syria as the two examples. See, how do we partner with you when you call for regime change? We're against it for domestic reasons, and we're really concerned about domestic reasons. You did it in Ukraine, too. The Chinese perspective is the United States and the Europeans destabilized the Ukrainian government. That caused a lot of problems between Russia and Ukraine. But it's really about the United States and its regime change fetish. How do you partner with that when we don't agree on the way that you carry through with your ideas? And even in Afghanistan, which came up, stability in Afghanistan is in China's interest, but how do we partner with someone who wants to have liberal democracy? It's difficult. It's a difficult goal, and we don't see it as realistic. So it's more out of sadness than anger. It's kind of, what do we do with you even if we could? And I don't get the impression, to get back to the last panel, that China's eager to get involved in the Middle East. It's not eager to contribute lots of kinetic activity to any sort of multilateral effort. And then there's this real domestic concern, and it's pervasive. So everything is fed through that domestic lens. I don't think that the Chinese elites feel like the situation in China is stable. The Hong Kong situation worries them greatly, and partially for strategic reasons and partially, I think, for sincere reasons. They believe the United States and others are partially involved in that. That makes them less willing to partner on these global governance issues. So again, that's my report. Don't shoot the messenger. I think enough of you have read things I've written that I'm not, this is not the views of the State Department, Princeton University, or Tom Christensen. But I thought that I was going to stay true to Jonathan's mission and try to report the sense that I received when I was in China on my most recent trip.
Well, Tom, thanks a lot. I'm reminded of what Sergeant Friday used to say on Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am.
Dating yourself.
Yeah, I know I'm dating myself. Yes, you too.
So the reruns.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Jeff. What realistically or unrealistically can President Obama, under these kinds of circumstances, expect to put on the table when he meets with Xi Jinping next week? Or in some way, I mean, is there a ground on which we meet, at least on some of this array of issues that both Richard and Tom have outlined?
Oh, it's great to be the last person speaking at the end of a very long day. And, John Kerry having spoken yesterday on this subject, Tom Donilon this morning, Carolyn Atkinson at lunch, and the last panel having swept right over this landscape. I'm not sure what to add. I thought terrific presentations in the last panel and here. I think Tom Christensen's got a future as a spokesman for the Chinese government if things don't work out at Princeton.
It is known to all.
So, you miss a few key phrases, but you do a better job of it than they do, frankly. Okay, how important are presidential trips to China? Obviously, they're important enough so that we convene the panel, so we obviously think they're somewhat important. I've been on a few of them. But how many of them really have made history? How many of them have been really consequential? Nixon's, Nixon's. Since then, except for a few of us experts, supposed experts, how many of us can remember the accomplishments of the numerous visits since then, and what impact they've had on the broader relationship? I mean, I would argue that, well, I'd argue against the previous positions I've held that the impact is somewhat limited. The public reporting that one will see about the trip in advance and during and after, what happens on the trip that reporters look at? There's a photo op before the meetings, 2 minutes of President Xi saying something and President Obama saying something. There'll be a press conference, and there'll be some staged public event. And out of that, journalists who have to write something about the trip will weave some elaborate narrative about the historic events that have unfolded based on these few snippets. They do the best they can. Sometimes they do a very good job. Sometimes, in my experience, they have a narrative worked out before, and then they see a few things on the trip that confirm it. But all that said, I think that there are some real things that a presidential trip can accomplish, and that I look for this trip to accomplish. The first thing, and I think the most important thing, is the relationship between the two presidents. I mean, that's what this is about. They're going to have, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 hours together, the two presidents, in either private or slightly larger settings. And countries don't make decisions, people make decisions. And for the two presidents to have a sense of what each other is about, to have some sense of predictability about how the other one reacts, some confidence in their word, that's a really important thing. So I think this, particularly in a crisis, this pays dividends. So I think that's the first thing we should look for. The second thing is trips force bureaucracies to reach conclusions on issues, or to try to produce that horrible government word of deliverables, so that our presidents can show how much they've accomplished on the trip. I think the two sides always try to indicate beforehand, don't expect deliverables, nor to lower expectations, and then they trot a few things out showing that they have exceeded the bar that they've set on the ground somewhere. I think the ones that we should look for on this trip, I think we should look for something in the military-to-military area. They have been discussing agreements on major military movements, on avoiding incidents at sea and in the air. The militaries on both sides have been working on it. Hopefully, they'll have something ready by the time of the trip. They've been working for quite some time on facilitating people-to-people contacts, including through our somewhat broken visa process. I think climate change, Secretary Kerry spoke about that at some length. There's been a lot of discussion about some kind of agreement that points the way towards specific commitments on caps on emissions by 2020. I don't know if they'll get there or not, but I expect there'll be some kind of a statement on climate change. Finally, the bilateral investment treaty. That's not going to get worked out this week. I think that's got a long way to go. To get a bit through the Senate, to get anything through the Senate, this requires 67 votes. When was the last time there were 67 votes on anything in the Senate? We couldn't get 67 votes on a UN convention on people with disabilities. So this is going to be a huge challenge to get the votes. But it's really important. This is a bit like the WTO in the sense that serious reformers on the Chinese side are looking for a bit to motivate domestic change inside of China. And this is an opportunity that we should not miss. Finally, of course, global issues, that's mostly private discussion. Whether we'll see substantial changes on the vast array of issues, obviously issues like Russia, Ukraine, ISIS, ISIL, ICE, whatever we call it nowadays, Afghanistan, Iran nuclear program, North Korea, and Ebola, Africa, to name a few. think it was mentioned in the previous panel, I think the Chinese are making pretty substantial contributions in dealing with Ebola in Africa. They've already put out, I think, 400 million renminbi, and they were looking to commit another 500 million. They've sent a few hundred people to the area. I think it's very impressive what they've done. And yeah, someone mentioned they have their own motives. Sure, we all have our own motives for doing things. But if we're talking about China as a global, trying to become a global stakeholder and trying to contribute to public goods, this is a good opportunity, and this is a good example of China doing something in that category. I'd say the fourth thing one should look for on a trip like this is to try to set a positive trajectory for U.S.-China relations after some difficulties over the last year or two. As I think Tom went through in some detail and others have talked about, the Chinese are connecting a lot of dots right now. They're connecting dots of U.S. behavior in the East China Sea. What they see is U.S. backing their adversaries in every territorial dispute. Hong Kong, where they see a U.S. black hand. What they see is U.S. subversion of the Chinese Communist Party. The South China Sea. We have policies on all these. Our policies, we should not be defensive about them. We should state them very clearly. But at the same time, we should make clear to the Chinese that these are dots. These are not part of a grand conspiracy. Our positions are going to remain, but they're not going to, but this is not a sign of a plot designed to overthrow the Chinese government. We need to come out of this trip with some sense of the stability of U.S.-China relations. We have a lot of problems in the world right now, and you all know about them. And the idea that we should add to sort of chaos in the Middle East, infrastructure breakdown in Africa, and revival of Cold War tensions along the lines of Eastern Europe, an unstable U.S.-China relationship, that really would be sort of global system overload. And the other thing to remember when you're messaging on these trips is your message is not only, of course, to the Chinese, but there are other countries in Asia that are watching very closely what you do and what you say on the trip. And so this can't be a one-sided set of messages. And the last thing I'd say that the President is going to have to try to achieve on the trip, it's been alluded to, but I have to close on this point. Something happened yesterday. The Chinese know it. But the President is not going at the strongest point in his presidency. Look, I went on a trip with the President in 2010. We went right after what President Obama referred to as a shellacking in the polls. So this is how should I say? This is redux. He's familiar with this problem. It is critical for him to project that whatever is going on in the U.S. Congress and whatever going on in our domestic agenda, that he has a clear vision of his foreign policy, that the President runs and conducts foreign policy in the United States, that he can do so whether it's 54-46 in the Senate or 100-0 in the Senate. He has a constitutional ability and a constitutional prerogative to do that. He has to demonstrate the clarity of his policies on each of these other issues. This is absolutely critical. Look, China's rise has occurred in the last 40 years in the context of a U.S.-dominated international order. And if we reach a point where the Chinese are persuaded that U.S.-dominated, U.S.-led, whatever word you use, international order is being shred or is weakening, I think all bets are off in terms of the directions in which China is to go. So the President has to be very clear on that messaging.
Jeff, thank you very, very much. You get the Stakhanovite Award because you helped begin this program this morning, and now you're ending up at the conclusion as well. The conclusion I take, and I would, rather than ask each of you individual questions, just make a general comment and then open it up to the audience, is that irrespective of the suspicions, the uncertainties, Chinese paranoia about one question or another, there are compelling reasons for the two leaders to carve out at least some degree of common ground. I also take away from this a sense that whatever the negative perceptions of the United States and even if President Obama is in a much weaker political position now than he was 24 hours ago, there are 2 years left in his presidency. And there is a lot that indeed can be done. In fact, I would say from what we've been hearing from a number of individuals today, including people in the administration, there's a belief that there can be some headway, maybe not on the classic hard security issues in all cases, but rather than sit still or do nothing or just kick the can down the road, you have to see what you can achieve, because 2 years in politics is a very, very long time. And we have to assume that within Beijing, leaders there are asking themselves, do we just fritter away the next couple of years? Is that a realistic objective? Or do you try to advance where you can interests that overlap? And I think that the answer, to me, even amidst all these uncertainties and suspicions, is pretty self-evident to the degree that in this very, very contingent world we can sustain all of that. Sure, Richard. Yeah, please.
I think that if you're sitting in Beijing, and let's assume you have a certain amount of common sense, you have to ask yourself, will the next president of the United States, in terms of his or her policy preferences, be better than what they've got now? And is there a way to use the next 2 years to create an environment for the U.S. campaign and for the next administration that sort of hedges China's position and protects its interests?
Just say one thing on that, is that I heard persistent concerns that former Secretary Clinton would be the next president of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
persistent concerns. In other words, the idea that the first term of the Obama administration was much more focused and assertive, and that if she were in charge, that maybe they'd have more challenges from the United States. And again, I'm just reporting that. It's not a partisan statement.
Don't shoot him.
No, it's a partisan statement. It's a Chinese Communist Party statement. but that was a persistent. Do you think she can win, and do you think she'll be anti-China if she does? Those are the kinds of questions I received.
Yeah.
Tom, I wonder if you were in Beijing today, would the questions would be posed less about her and more about a presumptive Republican challenger?
I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know.
No, we don't know.
I mean, on that, I just said, I've had that conversation with the Chinese, and I've usually said to them is, we don't get to pick your president, you don't get to pick our president. Your president isn't necessarily the one we would choose, and our president won't be necessarily the one you would choose. I mean, speaking from experience with Secretary Clinton, look, Chinese officials know her extremely well by now. Yeah. I agree with Tom that there is a perception that has been spread about Secretary Clinton that we all pick up when we travel. But I think that the senior leadership does have a pretty good sense of what she's about, and I think Secretary Clinton, just as Tom spoke for the Chinese Communist Party without authorization, I'll speak for Secretary Clinton without authorization. I think that there are two sides to Secretary Clinton that are relevant here. One is someone who's had some experiences in China that were not ideal. The Women's Conference back in 1995, the editing of her autobiography, the massive editing of her autobiography without authorization. She has strong views on a number of issues, such as human rights, which cause Chinese leaders problems. On the other hand, she is an eminently practical person. She is not, ideological in her approach to relations. So, were she to be elected, that's kind of the two sides they'll be dealing with, and they'll have to figure out how.
And just to be clear, the senior Chinese leadership was busy while I was there, so I didn't need to.
This banter on the stage has been great fun, but it's unfair to the audience. So in the sense that I'm sure a number of you have questions, raise your hands, identify yourselves, keep it short, and make it a question. No comments. If anyone goes off on a long sermon, I'll make sure that that's the end of your sermon very, very quickly. The first hand I saw is here, and then the second one I saw is over here.
My name is Fraser Stevens. I'm here on a personal title. There's been a lot of talk today about Sino-American cooperation. What is missing in the discussion thus far, in my opinion, is taking China's strategic concerns seriously. For example, naval exercise and intelligence gathering off China's coast, the militarization of the Miyako Strait by treaty ally Japan, and the overall Chinese feeling of containment by US and its regional allies. My question to you is, isn't it required for mitigating the security dilemma dynamics between the US and China and moving the relationship towards what Henry Kissinger calls a Pacific community, that China's core security interests are taken seriously? I think.
Fair question. Does anyone want to tackle it?
No, I'll start. I think that, first of all, how China looks at its strategic situation is a function of its own system. And that system can have an accurate perception of China's threat environment, or it can't. And previous speakers have talked about sort of the DNA of Chinese Communist Party approach to this as assuming that if the actions of the United States are somehow directed negatively against them. So certainly we should do our best to reassure China about what we're up to and why we do what we do. But at the end of the day, there may be aspects of how China sees this as that we can't fix. Second, on respecting China's core interests and major concerns, in theory, yes, but how China defines those core interests and strategic concerns often conflict very much with U.S. long-established interests. And if the result of respecting their core interests is spheres of influence in the East Asian region, we're not going to go there.
Tom, was there
what he said.
What he says, okay.
The only thing I'd say is we get hung up on the phrase core interests. I prefer, personally, phrases like vital national interests, and every country has vital national interests. We should all be cognizant of every country's vital national interests, but that doesn't mean we accept every country's definition of its vital national interests 100%. I think Richard summed up perfectly the potential areas of conflict between vital national interests.
Just on that thing, it's more of like a baseball score. If you look at the core interests that China describes for itself and the U.S. view of its role in the region, the first core interest is the preservation of the single-party rule of the Communist Party. The second is territorial integrity by the current Chinese map. And the third is an environment for is conducive to economic development. The U.S. really only agrees with the third. So it's very difficult on that basic level to say those are your core interests and we have to constantly respect them. I think both sides need to be realistic about how they approach those problems. The United States can never say that we support the permanent one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party, but we can say we're not taking actions to destabilize your nation. And in fact, when we encourage political reform in China, it's for the benefit, in our opinion, of the Chinese nation and the long-term stability of the Chinese nation that you would open up your political system over time. And fortunately, there are a lot of Chinese who agree with that. So it's not an outside imposition. There may not be a lot of top Chinese Communist Party leaders who agree with that, but there are lots of people in China who agree with that prospect, that for China as a nation to be stable, it will need to, over time, to open up its political system.
Tom, this issue actually came up in the last panel as well. And the question here is, do you think it would be appropriate or necessary or useful for an explicit public statement by the President of the United States along more or less the lines you just said? I mean,
I think it has been made. I mean, I don't have an encyclopedic memory of everything that President Obama said or everything that President Bush said, but that was certainly, when I was in the government in the last administration, that was the way we approached the human rights dialogue. It's the way we approached discussions of democratization. It wasn't that this is against China and we rejected the anti-China label that was often applied to those proposals. It's an expression of our concern about the long-term stability of your nation, which is important to you. It's also important to us. We wish you well. But to do well, you can't have an increasingly complex society with a simple political structure at the top of it. That won't last. And lots of your own people recognize that. And then the question is, how do you get there? Now, we're not going to try to, roll an explosive device under your table so we destabilize your country, but we are going to encourage you to do the right thing to stabilize it over the long term, which is going to require some degree of reform and political risk. And it's unfortunate for everybody when that isn't adopted. On human rights, the same thing. With the human rights dialogue, the first 20 minutes when I was involved in it was Assistant Secretary Kramer. He spent 20 minutes talking about American human rights violations. The Chinese seemed very surprised, but I thought it was brilliant. He talked about slavery. He talked about the fact that women couldn't vote. He talked about Jim Crow laws. He talked about Abu Ghraib. And he said, we violated universal principles of human rights, and we have no intellectual property rights over human rights. Now, learn from our mistakes, right? And let's talk about some of the problems you have, and we can all be better off for it. And I think that what Jeff has said so powerfully about President Obama's own background and how that can send a message to the world, I think is very powerful.
Very well done. Jeff.
Jonathan, I mean, the whole basis of the Shanghai Communique was a recognition that we had different social and political systems, but we were nonetheless going to move down the path towards normalization, which we ultimately achieved because our interests in the world required it. And a lot has changed since the Shanghai Communique, but I think that still remains the fundamental underpinning of the relationship, that we understand we have different social and political systems, but we've got to find ways to work together on all these other problems. Now, what Tom said about political reform in China, I agree with every word he said. I think that the challenge always with China and with Chinese is finding ways to communicate and ways to affect the situation, because usually when we talk about such matters, or our editorials talk about such matters, what the average Chinese hears is not what we think we're saying. What they are hearing is the imperialist attitude lecturing a China which is now finding its way in the world with your supposed superior knowledge on things that we can handle quite well without you. Thank you very much. That is the attitude one is going to encounter when one has these discussions. So one needs to find a language and a way of dealing with human rights, political reform issues that circumvents or goes over or under or around or permeates through this wall of interpretation that not just Xi Jinping, but even ordinary Chinese will bring. And there are ways of doing it. It can be done. But we should be thinking not in terms of how do we posture ourselves so we look good for our domestic audience, right, but how do we say and do things that actually have an impact on audiences and actors in China.
We should stop saying American values and stop saying Western values and just say human rights, universal values. That's a pet peeve of mine. I don't like it when we say push American values.
Tom, I had never heard the story you told about Assistant Secretary Kramer, but that was inspired.
Yeah, it was a great moment in our diplomacy. The reaction on the other side was marked. I mean, they were visibly surprised.
Fascinating. I think our esteemed director has a two-finger intervention. Do you want to make a two-finger? No, because there are other questioners.
I'm done, Mr. Anyway.
I can't wait. You'll wait. Okay. So the next is Susan Lawrence.
Thank you. Susan Lawrence, Congressional Research Service. I'm sorry to take us off this topic because I thought that was a very powerful set of discussions and particularly appreciated Tom's comments. But Tom, you brought up Middle East, and I just wondered if you might give us an evaluation of what I see as China's big Middle East initiative, which is this Silk Road economic belt that we hear so much about, that is meant to go all the way from China west to the Middle East and up to Europe.
They have a lot of initiatives like this in various regions. I just say my own opinion of these things, infrastructure investment, trade deals, anything that increases the connectivity of the Central Asian states in multiple directions so that those states are not fully dependent on Russia, which is the traditional dependence, are basically good for everybody. And if China succeeds in some of these institution building processes, my guess is the situation will be better than it was before that success was registered, but that where if it's not really competition, where the friction occurs with the United States and like-minded states is the opportunity costs that are missed when different mechanisms are used instead of the Chinese-driven mechanisms. In other words, that there might be a better way to bring in more people and have higher standards of transparency for the institutions that do the same service as the Chinese-led one. That would benefit everyone, including China. And I don't really see it as a zero-sum game. So if the TPP stumbles because it's a kind of a strange grouping and some other free trade agreement goes through, I don't think that's an enormous loss for our country, because the more free trade there is in Asia is probably good for the Asian region, which is probably good for our economy, probably good for the European economy. But it would be better still if we had a higher standard. And I think that's the way we should pitch it, because otherwise it looks like instead of running a race where you're trying to go faster than the other runner, it looks like we're playing football and we're tripping up the Chinese, trying to knock them over so that they don't make any progress with their neighbors, which is it's not really a prospect that's going to work over the long run, because the neighbors can't afford it. And it makes us look kind of it gives us a kind of zero-sum mentality, the impression of a zero-sum mentality that doesn't really work.
If I might just make another observation, it's very, very striking about these numbers that were tossed around just a day or two ago about the amount of money that China would put into the Maritime Silk Road. What I'm curious about, since this is clearly seen as a Chinese government initiative, as distinct from the AIIB, which is at least on the face of it supposed to be a new multilateral institution, are these separate pots of money? Or in a way, does this demonstrate why there is unease, legitimate unease among a lot of parties on exactly this issue?
When I was in China, in the China Daily, Jia Daozhong, the professor, very smart guy, he stated in the China Daily, I was surprised, he said, the AIIB is good for one reason. Our foreign investment in infrastructure is really corrupt. So if we have a lot of other foreign countries involved in the same bank, our foreign investment will be more effective because it will be less corrupt. And this is a Chinese professor said this in a Chinese newspaper.
We have a lot of other hands going up. The next one I saw was here.
Thank you. Scott Moore, Council on Foreign Relations. And so North Korea has come up a few times today, but I just wanted to invite some additional views from this panel on the extent to which we do have a greater convergence of interest between the United States and China toward North Korea. Thank you.
Yeah, I might take that. The other factor here, of course, is the position of the Republic of Korea. And I think actually there's a very interesting story here, which is actually more, if you will, a good news story, in the sense that I see a clear connection, in part, between the development of the China-ROK relationship and China's effort, or Xi Jinping's effort, I believe, to distance himself in some measure from the DPRK for its behavior, for a whole host of factors, because frankly, when the Chinese look at the two Koreas, they can see that there's one that works clearly and one that does not. And then some. Where do China's long-term interests lie? This entails the question of nuclear weapons and missiles, but it goes well beyond it. So in a lot of respects, I think that the fact that South Korea has evolved the kind of relationship with China, there are things that can come up between the two of them that, very frankly, it may not be as easy for the United States to address with China. This is a long-term story, but ironically enough, at a time when the arguments have been made about China being, quote-unquote, assertive here, there, and everywhere, what we're pushing is an argument we want them to be more assertive vis-a-vis the North. Now, I don't know what the end of this story is. I think a point that David Shambo has just left made is Chinese risk aversion. They're not going to do anything in just some sweeping gesture. That's just not the way they go about taking any kinds of risks or changes on as consequential a foreign policy issue as this. But the direction is clear, in my view. The Chinese are doing this for their own interests, but it's also something that serves, I think, a much larger regional interest as well. So it's a continuing, ongoing saga, but I think that the shifts in direction here are, to me at least, increasingly clear.
I agree with that. I'd only elaborate. I mean, there are some in China who hold the view that the impasse is really our fault. It's the United States' fault that we're not flexible enough and we're not willing to engage the North. I think the mainstream view here is that if North Korea was interested in changing its policies, then there might be a reason to engage, and that was reiterated, I think, just last week by Sid Seiler, but we don't see any sign, and
Yeah, I would just phrase it a little bit differently. If North Korea were willing to meet its obligations that it already negotiated, right? So it's not that it would change, that it would return to its earlier policies from which it diverged. And in China, they say you have preconditions for talks. That's not a precondition for talks. The precondition is being raised by North Korea, which is the precondition is you recognize this as a nuclear state, and you forget about everything we've agreed to before, and now we can talk. That's the precondition, and that needs to be driven home in Beijing. And I guess I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I realize that the reputation is that Xi Jinping is tougher on North Korea than his predecessor. That may be true in terms of optics and the foreign ministry instead of the Communist Party liaison department dealing with the relations and the end of the special relationship. But from 2009 to 2013, there was from what I understand, there's been a real deepening of the economic relationship between China and North Korea. So for them to dial that back a little bit still gives the North Korean regime tremendous sustenance. And that's what it's really all about. And I think it's a real shame, and I know a lot of Chinese observers agree with me, it's a real shame that China's foreign policy portfolio is so seriously damaged by its dysfunctional relationship with North Korea. I think it has a lot to do with party politics more than national interest. And I think it's a real shame for China, it's a real shame for the region, and the opportunity costs in terms of trust building and in terms of confidence building in Northeast Asia are huge. China's losing a lot in this process.
I guess I'd have a couple of points. First of all, it's very clear to me that Xi Jinping does hold a more hostile view towards Kim Jong-un and towards the North Korean regime than his predecessors. That's obvious in any number of ways, and any number of Chinese interlocutors will tell you that directly. The fact that his first visit was to South Korea and North Korea is not on the horizon tells you something. Chinese senior officials have told me of measures they have taken to constrain or damage relations with North Korea. They're all aware that their relations with North Korea are perhaps the worst they've ever been. In speaking to senior South Korean officials recently, what they have said is when they speak to Beijing about North Korea now, what they hear from Beijing sounds shockingly like what they hear from Washington. That's not my opinion. That's what South Korean officials
I might just add to that some of this
very high rankings.
This has seeped into Chinese public commentary as well, significant public commentary. Again, they're drawing their own conclusions in their own way. I agree with Tom that they've frittered away a lot of possibilities and opportunities here. If you really want to give a very, very specific manifestation to how you work in some measure of common purpose, if you really believe there is some new model of maybe.
Let Jeff finish. He's about to agree with me.
I'm going to work my way towards agreeing with Tom. It's circling around.
He just circuitous, yes.
I mean, the North Koreans clearly know they have a big China problem, which is why they've been reaching out to Japan, to Prime Minister Abe of all people. It's why they've been reaching out to Russia, and why they're doing their own fumbling version of reaching out to the U.S. Now, as Tom said, we have a September 2005 agreement. That's how you reach out to the U.S. And the North Koreans have persuaded themselves that they can release a prisoner and that constitutes a détente. There are only two ways in which North Korea can ever reach out to the United States. One is by serious commitment to denuclearization, and the other is through a serious commitment to economic reform, which can only be tied to the serious commitment to denuclearization. So I guess at the end of the day, I come out kind of where Tom is in being skeptical that we'll see dramatic changes, visible changes in Chinese behavior towards North Korea that bring North Korea to the point where we want them to be. China's lost some leverage with the deterioration of their relationship, and there are within the Chinese system significant constituencies, particularly in the PLA and in the party, who have these long-standing, nostalgic, lips and teeth type tight relations with the North Koreans. So this is not, it's not a simple thing for this ocean liner to change course.
Yes, David, right there. Yes.
David Sedney, formerly with the State and Defense Departments. A question for all three. The other big rising country in Asia is India. How do you see that playing into some of the dynamics you talked about? Maybe not just in terms of events next week, but over the next 2 years.
Who's our leading India person here?
Who's our leading India person? Jonathan.
David, let me just start with something. But I thought that Xi Jinping's visit to India was a staggering lost opportunity.
Yes.
For the way it played out. I mean, clearly, Xi and Modi wanted to put this relationship on a more solid track than it's been in the past. They both see benefits in a better relationship than China and India have had. And then all of a sudden, on the eve of the visit, you have the Chinese ambassador to India, who's been at post for, I don't know, some months, suddenly recalled for unknown reasons. Then you have episodes along the line of control which replicated the same pattern that occurred before Li Keqiang visited a year earlier, after which they reached agreement on new mechanisms to prevent such episodes. Modi raised the issue in, as best I can tell from the Indian press, in like 3 different occasions with Xi Jinping during the visit. What exactly happened? Who on the Chinese authorized who to do what? I'm not making assumptions about who caused it or who did what, but Xi Jinping could not have been happy about having Modi take over the meetings with him with the actions of a platoon up in the mountains. So, and I've seen some of the subsequent press commentary in India, which has not been favorable or positive about the relationship. So wherever they're going on this, and the BRICS Bank obviously is an attempt to try to build some sort of solidarity, and they clearly work together or in parallel on lots of issues like climate change, for example. Position contradiction to the U.S. They didn't get off to a good start.
I was just going to add to this. When Modi was chief minister in Gujarat, he traveled to China, I think, on 3 or 4 separate occasions, took examples, particularly from Guangdong, about things that India could do, and indeed, in Gujarat, he felt that he had some real successes along these lines. So I think that Xi, or for whatever reasons, or China writ large, frittered away a significant opportunity here. It doesn't mean that the door is in any way shut. I think it would be exceedingly healthy if we had a much more productive Sino-Indian relationship that recognized that India has a serious prime minister who has clear intentions to make more of his country and its position in the world than heretofore had been possible. But it's yet again a reminder of the kind of slippage that often happens in the Chinese systems for reasons that we really don't well understand. And again, I would only note here the irony. We think of Xi Jinping as this Xi in command model, but some of the times the theory and the practice seem at some significant variations. So we will see But I clearly think that Modi decided to limit some of what could have been a much more productive visit than actually occurred.
Say one thing about India is it applies to a lot of regional actors. I think India has an important role to play in that China needs to understand that some of its assertive behavior in the region is causing trouble not just with Washington, and Washington isn't behind everything. It needs to understand that that behavior is leading to closer relations among Asian states among themselves. And I think India has a real role to play there. I think it's healthy for India and Vietnam to get along have closer relations as China does some of the activities either on the land border or at sea. It's healthy for Japan and the Philippines to tighten their relationship. It would be healthy, and it's a shame that it isn't happening, for the Japanese and the South Koreans to get along better in response to their common challenges with North Korea, which has an indirect impact on China's foreign policy towards North Korea. And I thought that Jeff and company handled this extremely well in 2010. I was in China at the time on leave, and China really noticed when North Korean behavior started to create a tightening between Japan and South Korea and the United States. But in that order, Japan and South Korea, because these, from a Chinese perspective, are cats and dogs sleeping together, right? So you have a very unusual situation. And when they were brought together by North Korean behavior, I think it really got their attention. And from all public reports, it seems that China took a more constructive position on Peninsula affairs late in the year. And I think that was an accomplishment of the first term Obama administration in a very difficult time.
Chun.
Well, Chen Li, Brookings China Center, excellent panel. I have one quick comment and also question for Jeff. The comment is that, Tom, you not only represent the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, but also share your experience in the Republican administration. I think this is particularly wonderful for Brookings, really, reflect the best tradition of Brookings. Thank you.
Those political maps, there's very little overlap between the communist states and the...
Sure, yeah. The question for Jeff, I look at the basket of issues you outline, the expectation. On the economic front, you only mention about the bid. So there's not much on that front. I understand this is the panel for security, but on the other hand, both sides really have high expectation to discuss about economic issues. So if that's the case, and the bid also will not lead any concrete result in the near future, so do you think this will be perceived as kind of a lack of success on both sides? Particularly the APEC meeting is about the economic issues, and after that also there's a concern, there's an expectation, or kind of people's sentiment, just hope that something on the economic front will be achieved.
Well, I think I have very little doubt that the president and members of his team will talk about the implementation of the anti-monopoly law. That's been a huge concern to American business, and I assume you're all familiar with the issue, the way in which mainly the NDRC, but other agencies as well, have used the anti-monopoly law to impose fines and trade remedies for supposed monopolistic behavior on foreign companies. Now, the Chinese respond, oh, we're doing it to domestic companies as well. But there are sort of standards that have been developed in the United States and in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere for how one applies anti-monopoly laws. And China's fairly new to the game, and I think that certainly there are elements in NDRC that want to use the law for protectionist purposes. In some cases, it's simply inexperience. So I think that issue will come up. Another economic issue that's been touched on, not so much a bilateral issue, and I tread in this area with some trepidation, is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I doubt that President Obama will be raising it. Conceivable that the Chinese may be raising it. Without commenting on the administration's policy, which is somewhat murky and hard to read since they haven't said very much publicly about this institution, my personal view is that given the massive infrastructure needs in Asia, the idea that more resources are being proposed by China and potential partners is something that should not be dismissed lightly, that there should be an active dialogue with the Chinese by the US, by the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, the others who have not participated on what kind of a bank would satisfy the basic requirements of the international system, conform to the best practices of the World Bank and the ADB. I think that's for countries to simply stand outside and say this is a bad thing, and countries should not accept funding from this institution for needed dams or highways. And then when they come back and say, well, can you help us? And the answer is no, but don't take money from them because we don't like them. I'm not sure that's a compelling answer. But I think even more fundamentally.
Stated mildly, right?
But even more fundamentally, to me, this AIIB is kind of an interesting example of how we deal with the rise of China. Do we see, here is a China that suddenly is bringing massive resources to a problem, potential resources to a problem. And we are rightly insistent on the importance of multilateral norms for how such institutions work. Well, isn't this an opportunity for us to put these two things together and say that China is bringing new resources to a situation, the world has norms that have operated well, can't we marry these two things together rather than simply saying, let's go to our respective corners and fight. So I don't know how the issue, I've probably gone further than I should.
What he said. I agree entirely.
I think that's an issue that deserves a lot more discussion.
That's what I was saying earlier. Jeff just said it better. So.
You said briefer.
We have time for one last question, and I see a hand right there.
Thank you. Will Norris at the Texas A&M Bush School of Government. I'm here this year at Carnegie for the year. I had a question. I was wondering if the panelists could kind of give us our impressions. Maybe a nice one to wrap up with. Your interpretation of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping's impact on China's foreign policy, both regionally and globally. And you've each kind of touched on it, I think, in your initial opening remarks. But I wanted to give you a specific mechanism by which you can tell us a little bit more about how you view Xi Jinping and his influence on China's grand strategy or where it's headed. And that is, at the end of his time in office, what would you envision Xi Jinping's definition of success looks like in a security context in the region and globally?
When Jonathan sent his organizer's email to me, he asked me to talk about how Xi Jinping and the top leadership in China view the United States and the region. I just don't know. So there's not a lot of transparency in that system. I had the pleasure of spending about an hour with him when I was in the government when he was vice president, and I was quite impressed with his ability to talk about things all around the world, even though his job at the time was the unhappy task of running the Olympics, which, it had to succeed, right? So it was pretty high stress. But he did a terrific job of going through the entire world with my boss, Ambassador Negroponte, who was running the senior dialogue. So I was very impressed with his skill and intelligence. I don't know what he thinks about these various problems. China has various claims that it's claimed for a long time, and it finally has the capability to do something about them. And I'm not so sure how he differs in substantive ways from a invented Chinese leader that you would put in his place. I can be sure that since he's a political type, that whatever happens at the end of his year, it will be declared a success, right? He will have achieved lots of things. Whether he will actually be satisfied or not is more of a personality issue. I don't think he's raring for lots of fights. I don't get that impression. I do think that there's plenty of room given China's domestic fragilities, perceived domestic fragilities. I don't even know if they're real, but perceptions are reality in politics sometimes. They're perceived domestic fragilities that he could stumble into a lot of real problems in being assertive on the claims that already exist. And that's what worries me. And I'll just close by saying, in 2000, I wrote an article with Richard Betts in which I said, we're worried about China's rise and how it's going to manage these disputes, right? And I said, we're not picking on China here on a cultural level, because if China handles its rise as badly as the United States did in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, then the region's in big trouble. Because if it gets that kind of jingoism and it gets into that kind of mess, like we did with Spain, late 19th century, the region's going to be in big trouble. So let's hope that doesn't happen, and let's hope that his success is a non-event, which is he avoids that outcome.
It's an interesting question. I can only speculate. I mean, I would think that if in 2022 he could point to a more explicit understanding with Taiwan's leaders about what one China meant and how Taiwan fit into that, if he could look out over East Asia and believe that Asian governments were somewhat deferential to China's interests, if he believed that the United States was sort of more accommodating to China than it was when he came in, that from his point of view should be seen as a huge success. I don't know if that's what's going to happen. I sort of could sketch out a different version of the future. If I have a concern, in addition to the ones that Tom mentioned, it is that he has just a very general sense of where he wants to go over his tenure as General Secretary, and may be surprised, maybe has already been surprised at how his general approach is leading to reactions and outcomes that were not what he expected or was led to believe he could expect.
I think those answers were on the mark. I guess the only thing I'd add is I think he is not a rash man. I think he's decisive but not rash, and I think his view is that the incremental approach towards Chinese expansion of influence in the region and globally has been successful. And there's no reason to abandon that by sudden Hail Mary. I think that the goals are, as Richard laid out, having a greater sway, greater influence over its neighbors, and having the U.S. respect its position in the region, but not a tense relationship with the U.S. The problem is, of course, there can be miscalculations, and there are a lot of opportunity for miscalculations in all of the issues that we have in the region on which we have different views.
Thank you to all the panelists. I wish we had more time. I know there were a number of other hands going up, but all of you have been very, very patient and attentive. I hope you have taken a great deal from the day today. We certainly have. Let me also, in closing, thank the members of the Thornton Center staff, without whom this event would simply have not been possible. I see one directly in the back, and I see several in this room.